ladies and gentlemen. This man not only was my first keynote in London, but he's an international best-selling author. Bijan, thank you for coming with us today, and tell us about your topic and what we'll learn today.
Okay. So I'm going to talk about risk management according to ISO 14971. This is going to be kind of a high-level talk, more of a kind of a conversation than a tutorial. So I presume most of you are either experts already or know enough about it that I don't need to give a tutorial. So I'll give a general talk about it. Before I start, and Joe, I'll ask you, should I introduce myself? I have a few introduction slides, or I can go straight into the talk.
You can tell them a thing or two about you, but we don't need, all the slides and such. You're a friend of ours, but there'll be some folks later who join to watch the video, and they don't know you as well as we do. So just a little bit. And for that matter, some may not know about the standard. So again, just a little bit of cursory stuff, and then we can get into conversation. Okay, well, I'll tell you a little bit about myself, then since we have lots of time, I'll take about 5 minutes and tell you about my background a little bit. So for those who don't know me, so my name is Bijan Elahi. I'm a technical fellow at Medtronic and a corporate advisor on product safety. So I'm basically the guy they come to when they need to know about what to do about risk management at Medtronic. I do a lot of teaching. But I'll tell you, my background comes from aerospace. I used to work at NASA. And then about 29 years ago, I shifted to the medical device industry. I'm a product developer myself. I've developed a number of products, mostly class 3 implantable devices. Who have worked at a number of companies and now at Medtronic. I'm based in Florida, but I teach worldwide. It's my passion. It's just about all I do. I've trained over 6,000 people worldwide now. And I still teach in 2 universities in the Netherlands, one at TU Eindhoven and one at TU Delft. And then I used to live in Europe, and I just came back to America last year. So since I came back, the FDA asked me to teach in America as well. So I started teaching a graduate course in medical device risk management at Drexel University in Florida. Besides my work at Medtronic, I also teach public courses outside of Medtronic, and here's the slate of courses that I teach nowadays at outside of Medtronic. I contribute to ISO 14971 with comments, and these are my books, the 2 books that I've written on this subject. So that's just a little bit about me. So now I'm going to go to my topic, safety risk management for medical devices. First, what is risk management? Go to the fundamentals. Risk management is defined by ISO 14971 as the systematic application of management policies, procedures, and practices to the tasks of analyzing, evaluating, controlling, and monitoring risk. It's a pretty compact sentence with a lot of meaning in it. To dig into it a little bit more, it's a systematic application. So risk management is not ad hoc. It's a deliberate, methodical process. We apply management policies. Management policies are overarching documents or policies that govern the whole company. A large company like Medtronic, we have a global policy for the whole corporation, and then we have a number of procedures for different business units. A small company may have a combined one thing, like policies and procedures could become one thing. And then practices are those individual work instructions or templates that may be applicable to individual work sites. Now we go to if you do have slides, we're not seeing them.
Oh shoot! I thought I was sharing my screen. I'm sorry. Thank you for.
That's all good. Well, what you said was pretty easy to follow. Just watching you talk.
Okay. So let me share my screen. Sorry about that. I thought I was sharing my screen. Let me see. There we go. Okay. Thanks, Joe.
You're welcome.
Yeah, sorry about that. Right. So I was talking about we have 4 tasks, tasks of analyzing, evaluating, controlling, and monitoring risks. These are 4 specific activities that ISO 14971 asks for, and they're detailed in the standard as to what they are.
Risk management is truly an interdisciplinary endeavor. It touches on many areas such as engineering, science, mathematics, statistics, logic, law, psychology, sociology, clinical, regulatory, human factors, toxicology, quality, a lot. We can deduce that risk management is not something that any one person can claim to be able to do by themselves. It takes a lot of knowledge about a lot of different disciplines, so it's really a team effort. Well, now that we talked about risk management, next let's talk about what is risk. ISO 14971 defines risk as a combination of the probability of occurrence of harm and the severity of that harm. This sentence is not that clear because it's talking about combining two dissimilar things and it doesn't tell you how to do it. It doesn't really tell you what risk is exactly. In 1901, a gentleman by the name of Alan Willett wrote an article titled The Economic Theory of Risk and Insurance. In this article, there was this sentence: risk is the objectified uncertainty regarding the occurrence of an undesirable event. What's interesting about this sentence are two things. One of them, it says that risk is an undesirable event. So if you think about it, we never think of risk as about good things. You never worry about what is the risk of having a healthy child, or what is the risk of getting a great job. We worry about things we don't like to happen. So risk really is about undesirable events. The other part is about objectified uncertainty. So it's really talking about a probability. If I were to restate this in a more modern language, it would be this: risk is the probability of occurrence of something undesirable. In fact, if you think about listen to your own self, talk about risk, you hear the language of probability. You may hear yourself say something like, what are the chances of getting into a car accident? What's the probability of my company going bankrupt? Or what are the odds of losing money on this investment? So you hear the language of probability. For the medical device industry, I like this definition best because it uses two terms from ISO 14971. It says risk is the probability of sustaining harm in a hazardous situation. Harm and hazardous situations are two familiar terms from ISO 14971. So have you thought about when you hear the word risk or risk management, it means different things, depends on who's talking. Really, risk is not one thing. It's many things. I'm going to show you 8 kinds of risk here. If a project manager talks about risk management, he or she is talking about risk to the project. For example, what are the chances of being over budget or late on this project? If an design engineer talks about risk, they're talking about technical risks. For example, what are the chances of the design not meeting the requirements of that device? Or what are the chances of accidentally infringing on somebody else's IP, intellectual property? When a business leader talks about risk management, they're thinking about business risk. For example, we are developing a new product. What are the chances of losing money on this product? We're trying to make money. In ISO 14971, we only talk about one kind of risk, and that's safety risk. And in fact, safety risk comes in 2 flavors itself: risks to patients and users from the use of a medical device. And there's another kind of risk, we call it EHS in America. It stands for environmental health and safety. And this is also what OSHA cares about. It's the kind of risk that can be to your health, but not from the use of a medical device. Like if you slip and fall down, that would be that kind of a risk. Risk perception and tolerance varies from person to person. Would you agree with that? If you think about your own self, your family, your friends, you can see that there are different degrees of appetite and tolerance for risk.
Personally, I think I'm an excellent driver, but not everyone in my car agrees.
Yeah. So if you agree with that the risk perception and tolerance varies from person to person, you would not be wrong. In fact, if you look at paragraph D4 of edition 2 of ISO 14971, there is this sentence in there. It says, it is well established that the perception of risk often differs from empirically determined risk estimates. So what does that mean? It means we can do all the analysis and computations that we want on risk, but how people feel about risk is not necessarily in agreement with the computations. Therefore, The perception of risk from a wide cross-section of stakeholders should be taken into account when deciding what risk is acceptable. We, medical device manufacturers, are required to determine what is an acceptable amount of risk. But when we do that, we should consider the perception of a wide cross-section of stakeholders. So who are the stakeholders? They're doctors, nurses, patients, maybe patient groups, insurance companies, governmental agencies, even our own company. To meet the expectations of public opinion, it might be necessary to give additional weighting to some risks. There are types of risks that people are more afraid of than others, and so they demand more safety. You may have heard that it is safer to fly than to drive, right? Do you know why that is? It's because people are more afraid of falling out of the sky than getting into a car crash on the road. So they demanded more safety, and they got it. I come from the aerospace industry in the past, so I can tell you that the FAA, Federal Aviation Administration in the US, has a requirement that the probability of a catastrophic aircraft failure to be less than or equal to 10 to the minus 9 per flight hour. To illustrate how small this number is, if you take a regular commercial airplane and you fly it 10 hours a day, every day, without fail, it would take you 274,000 years of flying to arrive at the 10 to the 9th hour. So clearly, this is extremely safe. If you're wondering how come I see or hear of aircraft accidents from time to time, there are two reasons for that. One is that this does not account for non-failures of the aircraft. So any kind of terrorist activity, any kind of a deliberate, maybe crashing of the airplane or collisions, that doesn't count. And also there are about 300 million hours of flight times that are logged every year. So there's a lot of airplanes that are flying. I was curious myself as to, well, how much safer is flying compared to driving? So I looked up the AAA data about US highway deaths in 2016 and compared it with the rate of accidents that are tolerable by the FAA. And I calculated that flying is 520 times safer than driving. So I just did this for myself. This is not for public consumption, but I just wanted to know really how much safer is it? Take a look at this picture. Do you think the person in the pink shirt has a different tolerance and perception of risk than the people in the yellow? This is not photoshopped. This is a real picture that was taken in upstate New York in the early 1990s.
We don't know what happened to the man in the pink shirt, do we?
No. But clearly he was smiling and he was just fine. He thought the risk is okay. Mm-hmm. When an accident happens, the public perception of risk goes up high, maybe to 100%. This is just human nature. So if you think about just daily news, when we hear of an accident, our attention really gets focused on it. And this same thing happens in medical device companies. Imagine a company that makes hundreds of products and one of their products causes a safety issue. Suddenly, all the attention is on that product, as if all the other products have just faded from attention. And even though they still have risks, but all the energy and attention goes focused on that one device and one event. So takeaway is that we need to not lose focus on the rest of the risks that are still present. Another topic I would like to mention is the difference between risk management and risk elimination. In medical device industry, we do risk management. In other words, we recognize that risk is non-zero. There are no medical devices with zero risk. Risk elimination is about bringing risk down to zero, which practically is not possible. So risk elimination is one method of risk control, making a device safe by design or manufacture. It is a precursor to risk management. In some other industries, they just focus on risk elimination, but in medical device industry, we actually measure and manage risk. I'll talk about the role of ISO 14971. Prior to ISO 14971, there was no standard for medical device risk management. Companies did what they could. I've been doing medical device risk management since the early 1990s. So before there was an ISO 14971. What companies did was to do the best that they could. Some people did failure modes and effects analyses. Some people did FTAs, fault tree analysis. So whatever they could, whatever they thought would do the job. If ISO 14971 created a sensible and solid foundation upon which to do medical device risk management. Medical device manufacturers must convince the regulatory bodies that their devices are acceptably safe and that their benefits outweigh their risks. ISO 14971 is a recognized international standard, conformance to which allows the manufacturers to claim safety and that the benefits outweigh the risks to the regulatory agencies. This is also a benefit to the regulators. Put yourself in the shoes of a regulatory reviewer. Imagine how much work it would be to have to review hugely diverse approaches to demonstrating safety and benefit risk balance. ISO 14971 makes it easier for the reviewers to also review the work because they know there's this process that is available, is recognized. If somebody follows it, it's less work for the reviewers. A little bit about history of ISO 14971. It was originally developed in 1998 with the participation of delegates from 112 countries. ISO Technical Committee 210, Working Group 4 was formed to produce ISO 14971. Simultaneously, IEC 60601-1, third edition, was planning to include risk management in it by IEC SC 62A committee. When they realized they're doing similar work, they created the Joint Working Group 1 to produce what we know of as ISO 14971. From this, we can conclude that ISO 14971 is really simultaneously an IEC and an ISO standard. It was first released in year 2000, first edition, and then the second edition came out in year 2007. In 2012, the European Community released the first harmonized edition of ISO 14971. And it was called EN ISO 14971 2012. They meaning the European Community, identified some discrepancies between the Medical Device Directive and ISO 14971. So they attached 3 annexes, ZA, ZB, ZC, to it to account for the differences. In December of 2019, the third edition of ISO 14971 was released. This is the international version. In 2021, the harmonized version of the third edition of ISO 14971 was released, and it has a long name. Its name is EN ISO 14971 2019 plus A11 2021. The international version 2019 is a recognized consensus standard by the FDA. For the European Community, one should conform to the harmonized version. Now I'll talk a little bit about the requirements of ISO 14971 at a very high level. It says you must have a process and incorporate it in your product development process. So if you look at your product development process, you should see places where it requires you to do risk management. It says to have a plan, like any other activity. It's important to have a plan to describe what you're going to do. Use competent personnel. This stands without reason that, yes, persons who do risk management must know how to do risk management. So competency is expected and required. Of course, different kinds of roles require different competencies. Ensure completeness of risk control. This means that for all the identified hazards of your device, the risks must be controlled. Evaluate overall residual risk. The standard refers to overall residual risk. And what this means is that what is the totality of all the risks of a medical device to a patient? In fact, this is what a patient cares about, right? If you're a patient, what you worry about is what is your device going to do to me, not every individual risk. They matter less. So we need to evaluate the overall residual risk. And then a big action is to determine demonstrate that the benefits outweigh the risks of the device. And then we are required to do some production and post-production activities. And these are related to monitoring, collecting, analyzing the post-market data, and then taking appropriate actions. Risk management review is an activity that was introduced in the 2019 or the third edition of ISO 14971. It is after we are finished with the work of risk management, it is to review the work that was done, ensure that we followed the plan, ensure that our benefits outweigh our risks, ensure that we have listening systems for production and post-production data monitoring. It also says you must have a risk management file, which is just a repository of all the work artifacts that we create. And it says we should have traceability. And this is about traceability from every hazard to the analysis of that risks of that hazard, evaluation of the risks of that hazard, controls of the risks, the risk controls, verification of those risk controls, and the evaluation of the residual risk. These things need to be traced together. I'll now touch on some challenges with risk management. One challenge is about all hazards and harms. We are required to consider all hazards and harms related to a device. And the word all is the challenge. Is how do you know you haven't missed anything? This is really like asking for perfection. And real life has a habit of surprising even the best of us. Every medical device manufacturer either has or will experience some field safety corrective actions. I think the only ones who can say they never have had one are the ones that we haven't released a product yet. Another challenge is about risk estimation. The equation for risk is P1, or the probability of occurrence of a hazardous situation, times P2, which is the probability of receiving harm from that hazardous situation. Estimation of risk requires both of these ingredients, and sometimes it is difficult to estimate risk. For example, in case of software products, IEC 62304 says that there's no consensus to estimate the probability of occurrence of a software defect. And in fact, that's true in real life. Complex software systems are difficult, or if not impossible, to completely test. So there may be bugs lurking in there that could pop up at any time, and maybe they can lead to hazardous situations. IEC 62366 regarding usability says that we can't really estimate the probability of occurrence of a use error. So a user may make an error, create a hazard, lead to a hazardous situation. We can't say what is the likelihood that that's going to happen. So in these cases, we can't estimate our P1s, and without a P1, we can't estimate risk. Sometimes this even relates to new products. If you have a product with no historical background and there's no previous devices that we can look at as a basis, then it's just a guess in the beginning. Another one is risk evaluation. Risk evaluation is done by comparing the estimated residual risk against risk acceptance criteria. We did say that there is no zero risk medical device. This means the risk acceptance criteria would be a non-zero number. So let's say we say it's 10 to the minus 4. The probability of causing harm would be 1 in 10,000. So that's saying that we are going to release a product which we know a priori is going to harm 1 in 10,000 of our patients. Sounds really bad, but that's just life. And choosing that risk acceptance criteria is a challenge. Another one is about benefit risk analysis. This is generally a subjective decision and is based on expert opinion. Benefit is not a certainty. Not everybody receives the same benefit. Risk is also not a certainty. There's a probability. These are even not of the same units. So doing benefit risk analysis is also another challenge of risk management. Complaint handling and monitoring. another challenge. If anybody has worked in complaint handling or has had experience, you see that complaints are a hodgepodge of information, incomplete, unclear. You can't tell whether there's even causation. A patient may have multiple comorbidities. There could be multiple devices working on the patient, and the patient gets harmed. You get a call. You can't even tell if it was your device that did it. You don't know if there was another disease that did it. You don't know whether somebody tampered with a medical device. You don't know if they followed instructions or not. It's difficult. And then that's the complaint handling part. The complaint monitoring, which is to look for signals in the complaint data. You could do your best and could possibly still miss a signal. And the last one I mentioned is about complexity of risk management. Risk management has a lot of moving parts that are linked together. One change in any one part could ripple through the whole structure. Ensuring the integrity of your risk management file is a complex and difficult task. You need software tools to help you with that. I'm now going to talk about the cost of poor risk management. I don't know if any of you has heard about what's happening at Philips. This is a very new report from 24th of October, not many days ago.
I know your friend from Philips has heard of it.
Yes, it's probably very world famous now. In fact, what happened is that their CPAP and BPAP machines had a problem where they had some sound insulation made out of polyester and polyurethane, and sometimes this insulation would break down and its particles could be inhaled by the patient. As a result of this, they have had to recall 5.5 million machines. The embarrassment is huge. It has caused a 68% drop in share price. They have basically fired their CEO on the 15th of October, so just middle of last month. They appointed a new CEO, Roy Jacobs, who apologizes for handling of this sleep apnea recall. They're going to lay off 4,000 people, and they're estimating a 1.3 billion euros of loss. So it's really a huge thing, and it was really simple. Just a sound insulation kind of could degrade and release some particles. It's really, really expensive to not do risk management properly.
Behrooz, I won't ask you to talk much about it. Just I invited you back on. Does this touch your work directly? I imagine it does.
Who are you talking to, Joe?
To your friend Behrooz?
Yeah, sure.
Behrooz, yes. Does it?
What is your role there at Philips?
When I hired, it was the senior engineer 4, and yeah, this is true. They had a lot of problem with the return product, with the recall product on the business unit I work, and they had, let's say, poor performance, and they laid off many people on that time.
And do you work on sleep apnea today or no?
Sorry, I can't hear you.
I say, do you work on that product today or no?
Yes, with more,
Right.
with more, let's say, risk approach.
Well, thanks for joining us. I'm sure you have a more than full day.
Yeah. And by the way, we can't blame Philips to be like a bad actor. This happens to every company, the best of them. It's difficult to do proper risk management. It's not a trivial thing. And I feel sorry for Philips, and I sympathize with them, but this could happen to anyone. So I'll continue. One of the things that underpins the success of a medical technology company is having a safety culture. So what is culture? Culture is the lifeblood of a company. It's expressed in our mission, the ways we see ourselves, the values we hold, the ways we communicate and tell our stories, and our vision for the future. Culture helps us define who we are and to see ourselves in the context of the medtech industry and the communities in which we work. So what does a safety culture look like? I'll mention some characteristics. In a company with a good safety culture, top management attitude is that patient and user safety is paramount in the business of the company. There is a sense of safety for the people in the organization that they will not be punished for identifying safety risks of the products that the company produces. You can imagine that identifying safety risks delays product launches, and that costs money. Another characteristic is that people have no doubt that patient safety is first, and everybody wants to help their team to mitigate safety risks. There is trust and confidence in the risk management process, perhaps underpinned by publicized metrics. We are familiar with these signs in factories that says "N accident-free days." Something like that, not that, of course, but something that can measure how the risk management process is performing. Everyone has at least a basic understanding of risk management and how their individual work contributes to product safety. There's a cross-functional collaboration in the work of risk management. It takes all these different disciplines. They work together well. And finally, people operate based on the knowledge of risk, not based on fear and panic. That's the end of my presentation. I'm open to questions.
Longtime fans of the show know I typically invite lots of people to talk to make it more interactive, but you know this well. You teach practically for a living. You're an excellent instructor, very easy to listen to and follow. I appreciate it very much.
My pleasure. Thanks for inviting me. I'll stop sharing my screen now so I can talk.
Let's see. Sam, I'm inviting you to become a panelist so that you can ask your question directly.
Jackie, hello. I know many of the names here.
Let's see, Jackie, let's see if you are willing to come on. Show your video. There's Jackie. No, we can't hear you yet. I've invited you.
You're muted. Still muted, Jackie.
We'll get there. Okay, well, she's going to stay muted for now, and she waves.
Okay. Looks like Ryan's has a question.
Yes, and Hissam had his hand up first.
Yes, first of all, good to see you, Bijan, after 2017. So if you remember Montreal Medtronic.
Okay.
Yes. It's very good to see you after a while, and thanks, Joe, for arranging this talk. Secondly, a quick question. Risk management reports, not based on the recent 2019 1471, but based on the previous revisions, was requirement or no? Report was not requirement.
Always required. Risk management report is your article of persuasion. It is the instrument with which we persuade a notified body or regulatory agency to approve our product. So yeah, risk reports have always been required.
Because I didn't see the slide that you present as requirement. I see plan, I see review,
right.
I see report, but I faced with two startups that we never submitted reports to FDA.
What did you submit?
Okay. They were okay. We submitted risk management file with the plan, with the result, but not, again, the startup. Don't think about Medtronic, that more organized.
Sure.
But FDA doesn't have any problem. That's why I'm asking that. What could be the approach of FDA in this case?
Right. The output of the risk management review is the risk management report. That's one of the actions that I mentioned. So that output produces the report or reviews the report. But notified bodies are just humans like the rest of us, right? So if you can't persuade them by just giving them the risk management file and not the report, okay. But you're required to produce a report in general. I had not heard of anybody getting away without producing a report.
Thank you. And if
Rains?
Oh, okay.
Hey, enjoyed the presentation. I had two questions if we have time. One I'm more interested in now. Interested in any best practices you've seen in terms of traceability or risk controls, which was something you mentioned. Yeah. And I'd say I spend about half my time doing internal audits. So I see a lot of different approaches and levels of rigor in risk management for different teams, from class 1 devices to class 3 implantables, right? In referencing risk controls, some teams take it super high level. They'll reference a general aspect of a design. Some teams will have an objective reference to a document to say we've implemented this material, in go on. Other teams will get to a more detailed level and actually reference a particular dimension in design documentation, right? So there's this big spectrum in terms of specificity of what have you implemented as a risk control? And that's important, especially for bigger teams, for products over a longer period of time. Things change. One engineer might not understand that this dimension is implemented as a risk control, and unless there's a level of specificity, it can just be changed, right? So I didn't know if you'd seen any best practices. Would you call it a best practice to reference particular dimensions, materials, et cetera, in the risk management documentation? What do you recommend to teams?
My recommendation is for risk controls to be a narrative of intention, not a single dimension or a single requirement.
Okay.
So that narrative of intention then would be linked and traced to those design outputs that fulfill that intention. So if you're saying that my product will withstand 20 newtons of force, it may be the thickness of a part that is what fulfills that resistance. So your risk control would be the ability to withstand 20 newtons of force. It would be linked to that requirement that says it needs to have this much resistance, and that would be linked to the design output that says this is how we met that requirement.
Right. Okay. So it's kind of both. I think in my experience, I would agree with that. Some sort of narrative to give context, but a reference to a design output document where that design aspect is implemented. Okay.
It makes it easier for a reviewer to see what you're doing. Simply mentioning a dimension may not be so clear for a reviewer.
Yeah. And because then
Rams, let me hold your second question, because I've never had a queue of 6 questions before. So let's see how we do.
Very good.
Eddie Lynn, my loquacious friend, let's see if we can have a nice linear question for Bijan.
Okay. Good morning, everyone.
Good
Bijan,
morning.
thank you very much for a most informative and enlightening talk. I thoroughly enjoyed it.
My pleasure.
In a former life, I worked as an anesthesiologist. And as you know, anesthesiology is all about risk reduction. And in fact, our one-word motto for the American Society of Anesthesiology is vigilance. They say anesthesiology is 99% boredom and 1% terror. That of course isn't true, but I mean, if you had to really simplify, that's sometimes true. But working as a resident at one time.
Edward.
Yale. Yes.
Eddie.
Yes.
What's your question?
Okay. So what I want to say is that
It's important to know your customers, friends.
There's a lot of monitoring that we do. And it's very easy to say, well, do we really have to have all these 10 things always present, right? That we use to safeguard the patient. I can relate one instance in which a patient of mine was undergoing chest surgery, and there was a lot of blood loss and so on. And the nurse came and hung up blood, and so all these IV poles were very near the head end of the table where the anesthesiologist is, and I had an esophageal stethoscope in the esophagus, listening to the heart and lung sound, and I was watching the surgical field intently to see what's happening, so I can react, so I could react appropriately. And all of a sudden, all I heard was the heartbeat and total silence in the background. It was so eerily unnatural. I looked around and discovered my anesthesia circuit had disconnected, but I had ensured that it was on properly. Well, what happened is a big bag of IV and blood fell down, hit that circuitry, and knocked it off. Now, if I didn't have that device, that monitoring device in place, I would discover it belatedly after the patient become hypoxic or maybe have a cardiac arrest. And so it really drove home the importance that you never know what could happen to derail what would otherwise have been a very safe procedure. Now, because I discovered almost instantly, nothing happened, but that really drove home the importance of safety. And I really appreciate your teaching about how it is important to hold our responsibilities to mitigate risk in a sacred way. And it is not just for the patient's benefit. Ultimately, it's for the company's benefit. Look what happened to Philips.
Edward,
right.
Is it just an anecdote you wanted to share, or do you have a question?
Oh, it was just an anecdote.
Yeah,
Well,
I can just make a conclusion. Clinical experience, like Eddie just mentioned, when the bag fell and disconnected his anesthesia circuit, This is invaluable. A lot of times engineers can't imagine what can happen in real life in the clinics. I've had personal experience where we as engineers just thought the device is going to work properly, but then later on we learned from our clinical marketing people that in real life, they have seen things that we had not imagined as engineers. So it's very important to talk to clinicians, people who are actually in the front lines dealing with patients, and learn from them. So thank you for sharing that idea. That's a good,
Oh,
good
you're
story.
welcome. Thank you.
Maureen?
I have one comment and one question. So to the comment about the report not being included and the FDA granting that, companies don't always put all of their information into an FDA filing. That doesn't mean that the FDA isn't going to expect to see it when they come back on site. So I agreed with Bijan, you need the report. Just because the FDA didn't ask for it during the 510(k) process doesn't mean they don't expect to see it. They'll often go into much detail on an on-site audit. I worked at Physio Control, which went through 2 consent decrees. Trust me, I know they look for the other stuff. The question I have is that risk management is an ongoing process. The example you gave at Philips was great because there's always this process of discovery or finding out that something can happen per Eddie's. How do you recommend, or what's the best way you've seen of getting that updated risk analysis built into the company's process?
Yeah, if you have a well-connected post-market risk management to your pre-market, this information then will flow back from post-market learnings back into the pre-market. This is a challenge that many medical device companies have, that the post-market and pre-market are in 2 different worlds and they have a very weak connection. So the answer is to strengthen the connection and flow of information from post-market to pre-market.
Thank you, Maureen. Thank you, Bijan. Nelly?
I have a very quick, easy question. A lot of my clients are physicians that came up with a brilliant idea. It's their very first time a part of a medical device. And when you start to go into the risk management procedure, I've been looking for a nice introduction to risk. So, because like me and my buddy who do engineering a lot of times with the clients, we literally will read the standard, we'll go through it. So I don't know do you have like a nice introduction for like a bunch of physicians, like here's risk, here's why you're doing it, and then kind of that concept?
I do. Let me share my screen again and show you something. Second, oh, sorry, all right.
We don't see your screen yet, I think.
Yeah, I don't know why it's not showing up. Let me see. Okay, I need to close this and start again. I was going to show you my slide has the answer to your question, so I just thought instead of speaking it. Okay, now I can share my screen.
Still nothing. Well,
You see it?
okay,
See it?
here it comes. Yes, yes, now we do. Thank you.
All right, so as I was mentioning, I teach a slate of courses. These are public courses. This course number 101 is the answer to your question. This is a 4-hour course that goes over the fundamentals of risk management according to ISO 14971 and gives people a good, solid understanding so that they can at least speak the language of risk management and they can communicate with each other, understand what's required from ISO based on ISO 14971.
Have you recorded these topics so people around the world can access them?
No, they are taught based by invitation.
Okay, well, I'm sure you've considered it. I can think of a few people who would love to watch it if you ever do that. Denise?
Yeah.
Hi, thanks so much for your talk, Bijan. Really enjoyed it.
Pleasure.
I'm with UserWise. We focus on usability consulting, and I just had a quick question. Thank you for recognizing that 62366 does not, or it makes a comment that it's not easy to estimate occurrence, as does FDA. But yet we still are seeing a lot of companies focusing a lot of effort on estimating both a pre-mitigation occurrence and a post-mitigation occurrence. And that can be quite challenging because it takes up a lot of time and effort. And there's lots of discussions when maybe a pre-occurrence is even less valuable than a post-occurrence. Do you have any thoughts on whether a pre-occurrence is really necessary, because I know the 14971 says that you need to evaluate risk pre-mitigation.
If you're asking for my personal thought, I agree that pre-mitigation is not of much value, because what is presented to a patient? It is the
Right.
device post-mitigation. So who cares where we started? Is what we are delivering to the patient. And there are some cases where it actually is so senseless, like about use of biocompatible materials. Let's say if you're making an implantable device with a biocompatible material like titanium, well, what would be the pre-mitigation? Using plutonium or something? What kind of a toxic metal should you put in there to say this was my pre? People start with a good design. So I personally think it's not that valuable to look for pre-mitigation risks.
Great, thank you. I think we
Thank you.
align for sure.
Yeah.
Thanks.
Luke?
Unmute first. I have a few questions. First of all, should I buy the new edition or not?
No, the new edition, yes. Yeah, the new edition is, you see, the old edition was based on the second, ISO 14971 2019, sorry, 2007. And it was the latest edition of ISO 14971, the 2019 was not released yet. So when I released my first book, and then the second book also has a lot of new material, chapters and sections, and a worked out example of a hypothetical medical device that was reviewed both by that example was reviewed both by the FDA and BSI. So I definitely think the second edition is worth having.
Okay, I'll
Just
buy
for us lay people, how different was it? You know, not the book, the standard when it was updated. Is it dramatic or?
No, it wasn't a dramatic change, but there was a sufficient change that, and we are required to conform to the latest version of the standard. So
Of course.
if you read the old book, you're looking at the old version of the standard.
Okay,
Okay,
second
Luke,
question.
second question.
Everywhere I come, I see risk management done not perfect. And so our bottom line is always, are you willing to apply this device on your daughter, or do you rather apply it to your mother-in-law?
That's funny.
I can tell you anecdotal. Some of my own mother has a Medtronic device in her body that was designed and built by some of the engineers that took my own training. So I'm comfortable with her having that device in her.
Okay, and then how does it relate to the that they use it? It used to be to make the risks as low as reasonably possible, and now it's as low as possible. But where do you stop?
Yes.
Where do you stop? What is your opinion?
Yes. I have a risk reduction endpoint logic decision flowchart that I teach in one of my courses that helps you justify when you stop doing risk reduction.
That's very interesting. I think that would be a course unto itself.
Is that
Maybe
in your
if
book?
you're willing in January or so, I would love to have you just teach us that, because that's very interesting how to empirically decide, okay, let's not be crazy about this.
I can also point you to one sentence in EU MDR to reduce risk as far as possible without adversely affecting the benefit risk ratio. You can also look at that sentence and say, I can go to the point where my benefit risk ratio is now being adversely affected, and stop there.
Still, show of hands, who would like to have him back in a few months to talk about that specifically? Okay, that's unanimous. Susie?
Good morning, everybody. Very interesting. Thank you for your discussion and your knowledge. Just a quick question: is we're preparing for our first FDA device for submission for a 510K class 2. Would a quality control manual help in documenting all of the tests that we are conducting to mitigate risk?
I think it would be part of the answer, maybe not a complete answer. The quality control manual, to me, sounds like it's an instructional document that tells you how to manage your process. Whereas what the FDA would look for would be the tests and test cases and test results. So I don't know, in your company, are these all combined into one place, into one document?
Actually, we have a company that we've hired to conduct all the to prepare for FDA, and they're conducting all the tests for mitigating risk. at the moment. And, but we want to start our own quality control manual separate from the company that is preparing for it, just in case the FDA comes back to us, we have everything right there to show them.
Okay, so if by manual you mean a report of tests, yes, and that's something you want to present. Yeah.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yeah.
Rains,
Can I
you've
call
been
on one
patient.
person
Thank you.
myself? Can I call on one person myself?
Oh, yes.
Mr. Singh, Karandeep, how are you? Can you tell us about you? I've seen some of your videos.
Oh, hello. Okay.
Hi.
So, yep, I'm a quality and regulatory consultant, and the videos that you mentioned is just like yourself. I enjoy teaching, so I often make videos about quality and regulatory for people who are perhaps new to the industry or want to get into it. So I get like a complex topic like quality manuals or recalls or field safety corrective actions, and I summarize them into a small bite-sized video so everyone can understand it.
Yeah, I quite like your work, so my compliments.
Thank you. Oh, lovely. Nice. Rains?
Yeah, thanks. So I wanted to circle back around to, you also mentioned the EU harmonized version, so 2019 with 2021 amendment. So all the content deviations disappeared. Is that, accurate to say from the 2012 harmonized version? And, just to give an example, the 2012 harmonized version had a content deviation that, company information provided to the user would not lower your probability of occurrence of harm, right? So that's been kind of a famous one. So that's gone.
Yes.
Are notified bodies going to change their interpretation? What?
Yeah, 2012 harmonized edition really created a lot of confusion. I think it was really poorly written. It was a terrible standard.
Yeah.
But the confusion was that there is a difference between information for safety and disclosure of residual risk. The 2012 confused these things together, and people were really didn't know what to do, because sometimes you have to provide information for safety to a user to be able to safely use a device. So what I will tell you is that if you want to distinguish these two, information for safety is instructional and expects action by the user, whereas disclosure of residual risk is only informational and allows a user to make an informed decision. These are different. And when you provide information for safety as a risk control, you have to also verify it, just like any other risk control. So it has always been accepted as a way of reducing risk. It's just that the harmonized version in 2012, that annex, really confused people.
It sure did. Now it's a thing where you can't lower probability of occurrence of harm because of something you put in the IFU.
What they meant is that disclosure of residual risk does not reduce risk, and that is true. If you just say, my device could cause headaches. Well, okay, that doesn't make a device any safer. It just tells the user, if you use this, you may get headaches. Whereas if you tell them how to use the device safely, like imagine a reusable surgical instrument. If you teach people how do you clean it, how do you disinfect it and sterilize it, that does make it safer.
Yeah. But that's really interesting to know the intent there. Okay. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Rains. Kevin, I know you had a question.
Yeah, I just wanted to ask Bijan if he could just speak real quickly to the differences in risk assessment between the ISO standard and ICH Q9. And I ask it because I had a situation with an API supplier, following GMPs and ICH that had a massive quality problem related really to poor risk assessment that then caused, massive recall, with combination devices for a number of my customers.
I don't know enough to answer that question about ICH Q9s. I'm sorry. I don't use it.
Yep.
I can answer questions about ISO 14971. So
okay, well, I guess then the follow-up question is, if you're doing, somebody regulating devices and you have components that are coming in possibly with a different quality system, in this case, as I said, it was an API that was going into a number of combination devices. How does somebody control for that? Because even going in this case, you go into an API supplier, they're generally not following ISO. So from the audit side, how do you do that assessment internally?
Well, so it sounds like you are talking about the influence of risk from a supplied part to a medical device, and how do you connect these two together? In my teaching, I teach people how to connect it by using failure modes and effects analyses. the outputs of an FMEA by a supplier can become an input to the FMEA that you as a manufacturer of record can use.
Well, in this case, though, the supplier, and you know, it was a high quality supplier, I would say, who, you know, they went 30 years without a 483, you know, being inspected by FDA on the drug side, pretty much every 2 years. They still had they had a complete failure in their FMEA because they hadn't had a failure when they did their risk assessment. And this came down to a biological contamination. When they did the risk assessment, essentially, it came down to, we've never had a problem, so we only need to check our systems once a year. And I wound up having a full 5 months worth of production back out of the distribution channel.
Yeah. Unfortunately, that happens from time to time. If some event hasn't happened in the past, people presume that means it won't happen in the future. And so this is an error in judgment, I'd say. Yeah. There are so many stories of things like that happening. It's happened to my own company, one of my previous companies that I worked at, where a supplier changed something. We had been happy with them, nothing had ever gone wrong, and then suddenly our patients started dying, and we had no idea why, because something had changed in their own manufacturing, and our suppliers' manufacturing, and they hadn't told us.
This was very well attended. People stayed until the very end. They pushed back their meetings at the top of the hour to stay, and lots of comments here, all praising me for knowing you. Which I appreciate. I'll take it. You know, I'm easy. That's my friend, best-selling author, Bijan Elahi. And I think with all of you raising your hands so aggressively, we may get him back in January to talk about what is reasonable for saying, okay, we've mitigated risk as much as possible. What's the actual language then? Not reasonably possible anymore?
As far as possible.
As far as possible. Okay.
All practical.
Well, that's not the word. But all the same, okay. Thank you. Next week, my friend Alberto is the CEO of a young medical device company out of California. He came to my very first 10X in Minneapolis. It'll be good to have some quality time with him again. I hope you can all join us. And I'll see you soon. Thank you, everyone.
Thank you.
Have a great weekend.
Bye, everyone.